The physician, Dr. Pietro Maria Adelmare, paced up and down his study, letter in hand newly delivered, beads of perspiration forming on his brow. It could not be. He looked one more time at the seal he had so hurriedly broken, and yes, it was from Cambridge, where an ex-student Philippe was at medical school, and yes, the information so clearly written could have been nothing less than the truth. The doctor turned on his servant in frustrated anger and demanded again for the third time, when did this letter arrive? The day after you left for Treviso, master. I'm so sorry, sir. There was nothing I could do. I just didn't know. And hung his head, not daring to look in the direction of his irate master. 4 weeks, the physician thought. 4 whole weeks I have been away. 4 wasted weeks. 4 weeks in which I have continued my research, brought my notes up to date, anything. And now, only now do I find that there is another thinking as I do, working as I am working, thinking and reasoning as I do. His Italian blood flared yet again. He was short, broad, dark, and appallingly vain, dressed in the very latest fashion of a 16th century man of culture, wealth and breeding, would be the first to break new ground, confound the medical world and turn it on its head, to disprove the church in all its bigotry and scorn the Inquisition. Bring me wine and keep my goblet full, he snapped, with increased vexation at time lost. Frido, his bonded servant, cringed as he hurried to obey, for he knew that this instruction was the forerunner of intimate moments, horrific moments which he had vowed never to betray. He knew what he would see, and he knew what his instruction would be. It was ever thus on his master's return from Treviso, the birthplace of his master. He adored his master, and always had, right from those early days of his master's childhood, when he, Frido, had been given to his master by the senior Adelmare. Now, his master, on this very day, in the full flight of manhood, well versed in arts and medicine, Dr. Pietro Maria Adelmare stood high and proud in Venetian society. You may trim my beard and rearrange my hair. The doctor sounded deflated, in need of uplift. Yes, thought Frido, it is so, and next will come the ritual of undressing. Pietro drank deep from his goblet, held it high and into the light, and saw the red of the Venetian glass and the deep red of the wine, and thought that the answer must lie in the blood. He had doubted the professors when they said that the blood emanated from the liver. At dissections, Pietro had writhed as the heart was wrenched from the cadaver and thrown into the canal below the dissection table with ne'er a second thought. The heart is there, and it must have a reason. The answer lies in the blood, he reiterated time and again, the stanza constantly crossing his mind. The physician and bonded servant shared a secret. The servant a foil to the thinker, Pietro. The physician and the bonded servant held a secret. The servant a foil to the thinker. Pietro felt the comb in his hair. Harder, he barked, or rather intended so to do, but could not manage, and Frido heard the beginning of a slur. With my fingertips, sir. Yes, yes, but hard, and felt pleasure as his servant responded. "Oh, wine," he demanded. "Damn you, man, did I not say you were to keep my goblet full?" With an oversized gilt-frame looking glass held by the servant with some difficulty, to the front, to the back, and to the sides of his head, Pietro looked lovingly. First at his beard, and then his hair, took note of Frido's skill with scissors and comb, but said nothing, and wondered if in the whole of the city could be found another beard such as this, so black, so dense, so adroitly trimmed to the very latest fashion, or hair that shone so fine, that cascaded over the nape in such a glorious curve. He thought not. Bring hot eucalyptus oil and strips of linen and be quick. All had been prepared in dreadful anticipation, and so Frido quickly returned with a large brass bowl, which he mounted on a large tripod, poured in the hot oil, and placed a trio of little candles beneath to maintain the warmth of the oil. He draped the strips of linen over the back of a chair and murmured, "All is ready, sir." "Then you may undress me." The upstanding ruff was removed from around the doctor's neck, and the cape with its ermine trim and huge pads eased from his shoulders and carefully hung. The sword belt was removed, and the waist restraints of the doublet with extravagantly laced sleeves were eased, at which time Pietro gasped with relief. "I'll die for the sake of fashion." Frido went down on his knees in front of the physician, loosened the ties around his slippers, and gently eased the slippers free. He loosened the bows at the knee and reversed the hose down upon itself. "Would you now please stand, sir?" And having done so, Frido pulled down the canyons, and the voluminous, heavily laced underskirt cascaded down to the knees and hung loose at the wrists. Frido stood and waited for the next command. "Remove my shirt." And when Frido had done so, he saw the wheals, fresh, red and bruised, and as the masochist turned, the closing wounds that had trapped globules of ruby red reflected in the candlelight. "Bring me wine, I don't keep this full," he stuttered, and flung the goblet to the floor in a gesture of fury that concealed a burning disbelief of his appalling weaknesses and delight in the face of the flailing whip. The goblet shattered, and as Frido kneeled down to pick up the broken glass, the doctor, in a moment of compassion, rested his head momentarily on Frido's head, and slurring a little said, "It is the hand of fate that made me master and placed you where you are. God help us both." Frido, still kneeling, hung his head and was still. With goblet replaced and filled, Pietro took the glass and unsteadily crossed the studio floor to the examination couch, placed the wine with exaggerated care on a side table, climbed onto the couch, lay face down, folded his hands in front of his head, and lowered his forehead onto them, and said, "Begin." His mind drifted in thought. "Scorn the Inquisition," he thought, and scoffed. "I say I will, but how can I? How can anyone not fear the consequences of falling into their hands?" He writhed as the hot oil ran smoothly over his voluntary red raw wounds. He writhed not in pain, but with sheer, high, soaring pleasure, and thought his mind would burst, and the eucalyptus perfume assailed his nostrils, and he gulped in a deep breath of the perfumed air. How he loved these moments of ecstasy. He knew that the Inquisition was everywhere. The black, malevolent soul of the fraternity lay deep within the bowels of the Vatican. He squirmed as new hot oil ran over his shoulders, raised his head, arched his back, and cried out in joy. The sheer pleasure of controlled pain, he thought, as he was lifted by sheer joy to the very summit of Mount Olympus. He felt the linen strips being put into place, and knew the healing could now begin, and that also, in some perverse manner, brought pleasure. The hot oil ran lower down the physician's back. Frida had seen the vicious red welts across the buttocks, across the back of the thigh and calf, and cried silently for his master. The Inquisition, the wounded physician cried aloud. Ah, yes. And then in his thoughts he reasoned that whereas the soul of the fraternity lay at the heart of the church, its tentacles reached to the furthest regions of Christendom, penetrated the heart of every institution, and put fear into the minds of every man and woman. He felt the oil smoothed over his buttocks, but brought no pain. "Oh, not hot enough," he yelled. "I want the oil hotter. Do it!" He thought over his activities at the medical school and ran through the precautions he took against betrayal. The grave robbers knew him not. Delivery of the cadavers took place on the darkest of nights when there was no moon. The university theatre where he carried out his dissections was cleaned most carefully, and equipment returned to its ordered location. Times and dates of future activities were arranged in the physician's private surgery by laying medical equipment and books in certain formation, the codes to which were only known to two. "Hotter, man, hotter," he slurred. There lay the weak link. "Should not be two of us," he acknowledged, "but how can I arrange matters otherwise?" He remembered in particular some 3 months past, in the darkest reaches of the night, while immersed in dissection, he stood straight and arched his back to relieve discomfort, and as he did so looked up into the observation gallery and thought he glimpsed a movement. That of a person quickly backing into the shadows, perhaps. At the time he thought himself deceived by his own tiredness, but the moment haunted him. What if it were so? What if a spy had been sent to observe, and the thought of the church and their angels of death and destruction reaching out came to him time and again? But Pietro was driven by ambition and the need to resolve as yet the unknown heart. He was in need of another cadaver, and therefore in urgent need of an accomplice to arrange delivery. He had been told that in the infirmary for the destitute, a young woman in her early 30s lay dying. "Oh, she's no more than my age," he thought, with no great concern. "But I must have her. I need her heart." He felt the linen placed over the calves of his legs and knew that Frida's work was done. "You may leave me." "Your evening engagement, sir?" "Ah, yes, Palestrina. Maestro Giovanni Palestrina," he mused. The great man had laid aside his duties as choir master of the Julian Chapel at the Vatican and was doing a musical tour of the states of Florence and Venice, conducting choirs and giving organ recitals by invitation, and one such was from the Doge. Palestrina had arrived in the city some 3 weeks earlier, received the warmest of welcomes, and had set about the task of bringing the city's 2 principal choirs together and putting them to work. Such duties gave the maestro immense pleasure. He, Dr. Pietro Maria Adamare, had received an invitation from the palace. Contrapuntal composition for unaccompanied chorus was not a choice of music that he would have chosen, but an invitation from the palace was more in the nature of a royal command, and to have ignored it would invite only some petty retribution, and Pietro squirmed a little as he thought of those unholy inquisitional tentacles reaching out. "Lay out my very best black attire with plain cape, hat without plume or ornamentation, dress sword, accessories of the severest." He must not appear ostentatious in the face of such high authority, but his discretionary dress would court instant. Oh yes, attention he adored, but adverse comment he abhorred. Black Cloth was so expensive to produce, the dyes almost impossible to mix and blend, he thought, and therefore only worn by the wealthy and those of superior breeding and authority. High fashion in Venice was all. The city was riddled with a desire to overdress, to outdo, and to exhibit. The Doge had expressed his displeasure at such frippery, and plans were in hand to curb the excess. Pietro was aware of the gossip and would do all he could to place himself in favour with the Doge, and discreet dressing this very evening, with an awareness of his medical status, would carry favour. Discretion at all times, he thought, with an inward smile, and wrinkled his tortured back in deceitful collaboration. Cover me, he said, and the servant billowed a most lovely violet velvet sheet over his master, and guided it gently as it settled over the tortured body. He bowed and retired. Pietro thought again about the condition of the heart and how it influenced his thinking. He remembered the old male cadaver upon which he worked, and how big was the heart, perhaps twice as large as he expected, and he pondered the reason. He recalled the younger man and how he had removed his heart, dissected, and found two of the valves choked, corroded almost. Why? Was it because the body was not fresh? The cadaver had been old, and he'd always stressed the need for fresh bodies. He must be stricter, more insistent in his demands, he thought. Adjust payments and adjust inducements, but at all times he knew the need for proceeding with caution. Beware the moving shadow high above, he thought, as he recalled the incident in the theatre. But ambition, curiosity, and vanity drove him forward, and so the need for experimentation, observation, and deduction were all. He must have cadavers. Were the grave robbers not doing their work efficiently, leaving the exhumation too late perhaps? Was his agent regretting his undertaking, having second thoughts? Too late. He was too deeply implicated to even contemplate retraction. But in the event, or perhaps because of the body's condition, the dissection had been ruined. Pietro had cut badly through the left ventricle, which he felt was the reason rather than the excuse for so many unanswered questions that gyrated round his head. He reached for his wine, thought of the evening event that lay ahead, and murmured, "Oh no, not now," replaced the goblet untouched, and resumed his prone position. He thought back some 2,000 years to the Hippocratic school and to their discovery of the valves within the heart. Those ancient reports indicated no sense as to their meaning or function, and it had long since been held that because the arteries were empty at the time of autopsy, then the arteries were for the transport of air. It could not be so, thought Pietro, but how could he prove otherwise? He recalled Philippe's letter from Cambridge, and knew that he had to redouble his efforts if he were to be the first to reveal the mysteries of the heart. But his brain was not big enough. He thought only of the known and attempted to reason their improbability rather than seek new ground. His intelligence, superior as it was, lacked the capacity of reasoning and wrestling with the unknown. The original thought that propels the genius forward into new territory was beyond his reach. He could not accept his limitation. His vanity was an impediment to serious progression. The results of his experimentations with the hearts of oxen, pigs, horses and chickens showed similarities with the human heart, but there were differences, and these differences were, to his mind, key to the solution. Licenses were given for the use of cadavers, 2 per annum, and to the medical faculty of Padua only. Pietro thought this concession might well be extended to include him, and had, after due inquiry, and setting good advice to one side, made application. Vainness can be an encumbrance, and so proved to be, for not only was the application rejected, but drew authorities' attention to his activities, and henceforth he was carefully watched. But Pietro was not deterred. Pietro was driven by vanity, the need to be recognized by medical science as the proponent of advanced thinking, the need to add his name to the annals of the Renaissance. Pietro was proud to have been born into the 16th century. Was there ever such a time as this? Vast trade routes being established by the Spanish to the west and Portugal to the east, spawning his father's advancement in trade. Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo establishing a renaissance in the arts, and in the field of science, Galileo Galilei had made the first thermometer. Protestant Reformation challenging the rights of the Roman Catholic dominance was astir in Europe, leading to religious conflicts, and his name, Dr. Pietro Maria Adlamare, would be publicised and debated over the centuries to come. And Pietro was well pleased. The reception that evening was being held at the Grand Salon of the Palazzo Ducale, entry to which was via the golden staircase, which was never less than inspiring. A glittering message to the world indicating the wealth and power of Venice. Pietro lived nearby, just beyond Piazza San Marco, and would therefore walk the short distance to the Palazzo Ducale, but as short as the walk may be, he felt unsafe to walk alone, and was thus accompanied by Fido and a rather burly cellar man that he used from time to time. Pietro was impressed by the height, size and bulk of the man, and thought that would-be assailants would be deterred. And thus, in due course, he arrived at the palazzo, stood in line, and when his name was called, stepped forward with deference and propriety, took the hand of the Doge, kissed his ring of state, and wished him God's blessings. Good evening, Pietro Maria. The Doge and the doctor exchanged salutations, and then, may I introduce our guest of the evening, Maestro Giovanni Palestrina. Each looked, and with a bow that was hardly perceptible, acknowledged the other. The three briefly exchanged pleasantries, and then the Doge, in a whisper, said, "You are graduated in the arts, Pietro Maria, are you not? Perhaps, like our guest here, you should turn your attention more in their direction." The warning was clear, and it was direct. The Doge knew, the Doge was aware, danger was lurking at the physician's door. His father and the Doge were friends from university days, and had remained close for many years until, gradually, marriage and progression through their diverging interests drew them apart. But it seemed now the Doge was protecting his old friend from the hideous consequences of what he saw as the son's folly. Pietro was shaken. He must think carefully, and the consequences of the Doge's warning, and he took his seat in a state of agitation, and as if in sympathy, his tortured back itched violently. The singing grated on Pietro's nerves, the organ music was far too loud, and with Pietro's mind in a state of turmoil, he began to feel ill. During an interval while the choir was leaving the platform, Pietro stood, looked across the salon towards the Doge, caught his eye, bowed gracefully, and retired. The Doge, having seen, quickly lowered his eyes, in fear of someone watching him. No one, not even he, the Doge, was beyond the reach of the Inquisition, and his warning this evening to his old friend's son was a breach of his coronation oath, and placed him in considerable danger. What, the Doge thought, if the great Palestrina should report that fragment of conversation? But it was, he argued, just one among many remarks made in the course of the evening, and so he shrugged off his fears and settled to the music. It was mid-morning 2 days following the concert. Pietro was sitting at his desk working on his diaries when Frido rushed in without knocking and awaiting permission for entry and said, "Master, this is for you. It's most urgent. You must read it at once. Forgive me, master." Pietro's reprimand of his servant's insolent intrusion froze on his lips as he looked into the face of the anxious man. He took the note, broke the seal, and read, "Leave at once. You have less than 1 hour." As his face paled, so his mind concentrated on the urgency of the matter and the thought of the Doge's warning. He looked at the seal, but it bore no insignia. The source of the warning was unclear, but he must accept its authenticity. He looked at Frido and instructed him to go at once to the Da Luca shipyards at Squirro di San Trovaso and seek out the eldest son Antonio. Frido must alert him of his arrival and the need for departure within the hour. Make sure you're alone when you speak to him. Make sure you're not overheard, and at all times act calmly and naturally. You are to hurry, but not seem to be hurrying. Make sure you're not being followed. Take diversions along the way if you feel it necessary, but hurry. Take only a bag and a few ducats as if going to the fish markets. Without acknowledgement, Frido, petrified to the very root of his being, turned and was gone. He will not fail me, thought Pietro. He cannot. He must not. My life is in his hands. The physician looked again at the note and thought that it must be destroyed. He went to the fireplace, lit a taper, set it to the note, and waited impatiently until the last fragment was burnt. He crunched the burnt remains into dust and blew them into the grate. Pietro had laid plans for such an emergency. Such was the uncertainty at the time that many a Venetian nobleman planned to escape the dreadful moment of the pending arrest and lived in a state of constant apprehension. The atmosphere of fear and uncertainty created was a measure of the church's dislike and envy of Venetian wealth and power. The papal authorities were well aware that Venetian notables made arrangements for their escape. Through the bishops, the church was constantly seeking information that may thwart the escape of people they wished to keep under surveillance and so choose the moment of arrest. These angels of death, on the authority of the Pope, swooped at a moment's notice and expected to net their prey. Pietro returned to his desk, reached for the spring to release the secret door within the desk, and removed a key and 7 small bags containing gold rings and coins. He took the key, stepped quickly to his dressing room, walked into the larger of the 2 wardrobes, swept aside racks of clothes, and revealed the compartment at the rear, took the key and opened its door. Within was suitable clothing for travel bereft of Pietro's usual ornamentation. A large wallet suitable for hand-carrying, containing all necessary false documents for concealing his identity en route, and letters of introduction in his own name, both to the court of Queen Mary and his father's bankers in Threadneedle Street in London. He changed quickly, secured the bags of gold around his waist beneath his undershirt, and with leather pouch safe and sword tightly buckled, Pietro quickly and silently left his home. It was a fine day in the spring of 1548, a day that was to prove to be his very last in Venice. He would never return to his beautiful home, and he knew that in his absence the authorities would confiscate both it and all within, that he would be stripped of rank and titles and disgraced. To remain was to be apprehended, interrogated, and tried, and if his alleged misdeeds were construed as heresy, then he would be found guilty, handed over to the secular authorities, and the Doge, his father's old friend, would be obliged by his oath of office to give an assent and signet to his death. By papal direction, this could only be death at the stake by burning and witnessed by the public at large. As the door closed behind him, on the instant, he became a fugitive. He slipped through the alleyways beyond, crossed over the first canal, hurried to the next, and sought a gondola with a false, that is, a small open cabin, in which to conceal himself from the gaze of idlers strolling along the canal side. He wanted, if he could quickly find one, a gondola powered by more than one oarsman. He journeyed first in the direction opposite to his direction, changed from the first gondola, hurried from one canal to another, took a second boat and yet a third, and hoped, in this manner, to wholly defy his pursuers, or, if not, at least to give him time to embark and sail away. As he traversed the canals and alleyways, he prayed that his contact at the shipyard would not renege, or worse, betray him, but that the lure of gold would hold him true to his task. A squad from the palace guard were detached and instructed to report to the bishop's office. "It'll be a hunt we're on, lads, you can be sure of that," said their sergeant as they fell into rank. A murmur of pleasure rippled between them. Not one of them was sorry to see an high and mighty brought down, and like the majority of the townsfolk, enjoyed witnessing a good roasting, and so they would be dutiful, perhaps overzealous. In carrying out their duties, they would find their man. Venice had been denied such a burning heretic for more than 3 years, and earnestly hoped this one, whoever he was, would not recant his blasphemies. Smartly rigged and proud in posture, the 10 men and the sergeant marched the short distance in high spirits betwixt palace, barracks, and assembly area behind the bishop's office and the basilica. The subject of today's hunt was a man whom the bishop particularly disliked. He disliked the man swaggering and posturing, and was deeply aroused at the accusations of grave robbing and desecration. He envied him his wealth and connection with the Doge, and the bishop had a long festering urge to get even with the Doge over a slight he mistakenly thought had been aimed in his direction. The church would take a share of the man's property, and at the thoughts the bishop allowed himself to smile. With such thoughts in mind, he waived delegation and dismissed his aide, saying he would attend to the matter of instructing the guard, left his office, went to the point of assembly, and addressed the sergeant and his men. He wished them Godspeed, and in a moment of affability swung his arm and said, "Let them have wine." Turning to a straggler standing by, he said, You see to it." There was a short delay whilst wooden beakers and wine were prepared, and an observant looker on would have noticed how slow the man was in carrying out his order. But the mood of the moment was light-hearted. "A hunting we will go," said they, and so no notice was taken. The wine was served, hastily gulped down, and the call for more went up, but the wine-bearer was nowhere to be seen. His task done, he had melted away with thoughts of praise and a rich reward for an ill deed quickly executed. Within a moment or two, the sergeant clutched at his throat, choked, reeled, and gasping, spluttered that he had been poisoned, fell to his knees, and collapsed. He writhed and tried to speak, but his last words were incoherent as he passed into his extremity. The squad could not be acted to act on their own, thought the bishop, and so one of their number was ordered to return at the double to headquarters, report the incident, and upon the bishop's urgent request to send a replacement sergeant with all due haste. A dying sergeant was of no concern to the bishop, merely an impediment to the progress of the task in hand, but he would seek out the perpetrator of this outrage. He would look more closely at this Adalbari family as a whole. He would seek out the culprit, bring him in, thus to reveal the name of his paymaster. He would not rest until justice, as he saw it, was done. The Doge was at work with his 3 secretaries. He had the extraordinary ability to turn from one to the other, dissecting a letter in part to each and all of unrelated content. He quietly paced his office while dictating, but at all times positioned himself so that he had a clear view of the courtyard below. In such manner and in such circumstances of work were his secretaries favourably positioned to report on the whereabouts of their master if so called upon to bear witness of his whereabouts, and it was from his office window the Doge saw the soldier hurrying towards the barracks. The Doge was well content, and to himself wished his old and revered friend's idiotic son Godspeed. Pietro stepped out of the gondola and turned away from the shipyards, walked some 200 metres, turned to an alley, and then doubled back. As he approached the De Luca property, he could see a small single-mast cargo vessel being loaded, and prayed most earnestly that this was for him. Frido moved out of the warehouse across the quay and moved quietly to his master and led the way back into an adjacent office, and there Pietro and Antonio met and the deal struck. At the precise moment that Pietro stepped aboard the sailing ship, there was a loud hammering on the door of the Villa Adelmare, but it was too late. The bird had flown. The journey to the Britannic Isles was to prove long and never beyond the reach of danger. It was all very well to step ashore at Trieste and be welcomed as a Venetian gentleman, escorted by his manservant. But to journey through the Ottoman Empire, steeped in Islam, and expanding as it was along their proposed route as the coastal territories of North Africa, was to call upon Pietro's reserves of planning, cunning and determination. And it must be remembered, he was high-born, protected and not versed in the ways of the street. The journey would not be easy, and the first seed of doubt as to the wisdom of his flight was sown. But he was driven forward in the knowledge that there was no way back. Disguise in the local manner was proposed by their temporary host, and proved over the ensuing months to be their salvation. The 2 men adopted the local dress of thobe and gutra, with a gall correctly worn square upon the head, with Pietro suppressing the urge of vanity to place at a jaunty angle, which, if he had done so, would have drawn attention from the pious, and hair and beards were allowed to grow untrimmed. The calls to prayer throughout their 2-year journey in Muslim lands were of particular difficulty, for at each time, there were 5 every day, they could not be seen at large, but they adapted and learnt, hid, sheltered, and moved forward. Pietro had much to learn in the art of blending into the local culture, and was constantly impeded by his vanity, his tendency to strut in the Venetian manner, and his perceived accepted rights of the highborn. But the humble Frido, on the other hand, readily adapted to the changed circumstances, and was able to move more freely among the common folk in the souks and elsewhere, and thus gain local news and information concerning the route ahead. Quickly, Frido adapted to his new role of guide and mediator, felt the weaknesses in his master, and against all ingrained teaching of a bonded servant's upbringing over the months, grew in stature, and almost imperceptible swing of balance between master and servant took place. Pietro recognised this growing confidence in his servant, but set the tendency aside as a matter of expediency. To survive and reach London safely was all, and he would deal with the matter all in good time. Frido learned that the Islamic dress varied in detail from one area to another, and was quick to advise his master accordingly. And this was particularly important when using sailing vessels, which allowed moving more rapidly from one territory to another. And this they did whenever they could, but landing in a new African sultanate or emirate with variations to dress and custom brought immediate problems. And it seemed to Pietro that it was the boys, always to be found at the landing stages, with their innate sense of mischievousness and intuitiveness, that posed the biggest problem. They were everywhere about you, and given the opportunity, delving into your luggage, your clothing even. And of course, there was always the need to slip from ship to shore with the minimum disturbance. It seemed that it was always these beggar boys at the ship's rail that were wise to the intent of men who, it must be believed, were not the men they purported to be. And thus it proved to be, and from time to time their true identity was put to the test. But at all times their disguise, wit and intelligence, and an occasional bribe, withheld scrutiny. And they moved on, and in the 7th month of their travels, Pietro and Frido landed at Alexandria. Pietro made his way to the internationally renowned library, and there immersed himself in tomes medical, but was confounded by Arabic script. His conceit allowed him to believe that the older volumes written in Latin would hold little of interest in regard to his research, and spent little time with them, and thus was his knowledge little advanced. He visited a number of the larger mosques, and commented enthusiastically upon their beauty, and praised Egyptian architecture for its care of detail, and of the most wonderful sweeping arches and Arabic design and script. Later visited the city baths, and at the entrance dismissed Frido, bade him to return at sunset, and entered. All was in accord with expectation. The baths were clean and spacious, the air heavily perfumed in the Turkish manner, and laying around on beautifully carved and ornamented chaise-longues, well-to-do Egyptians enjoying the pleasures of warm scented waters of the Beal, the deep probing reach of masseurs' fingers in overindulged flesh, or the delight of steam, and everywhere the attention of young men. He doubted that his Arabic disguise would allow him entrance, but with a brief exchange of work, his Arabic was hesitant, but his breeding obvious, he was warmly welcomed and introduced to the facilities. At the back of the public area he found a locked room, and through the lattice of the door panel saw hanging 2 whips, with thongs no less than 2 meters long. He felt his whole body quiver in excitement and anticipation of joys to come, and within a short time found himself naked, with shackled wrists and ankles, and strapped face down on a slanting frame, with 2 muscled Egyptians, with whips in hand and feet astride, looking down and awaiting his word of command. He was flailed from the top of his back to the bottom of his feet, and the wounds went deep. And whilst he thrilled at the pain, the swish of the whip, and the grunting of his torturers, the intensity of the lashes grew greater than he had ever before experienced, and he knew that all was not right. He was troubled and could not give himself over to the pleasures of controlled pain. This was not the warmth and familiarity of Treviso. This was not the laughter and bravado of well-bred friends with money and time to spare. This was not the all-consuming friendship born in infancy with which he was so familiar. This was depravity, and he was ashamed, deeply ashamed, and, as if in a revelation, saw the sham that his life had become, admitted the limitations of his medical skills, and cried out that he never would or could discover the truth of the heart, that he lacked capability, that his mind did not enjoy the necessary flight of exploration into unknown areas of learning. He lacked the power of reason and his diary is merely a distraction hiding his limitations. It was a fraud, he cried out to Charlotte, and sobbing, convulsed with tears dropping to the floor beneath him, and with a loud, convoluted cry, begged his tormentors to stop. This day would mark a turning point in Pietro's life. He had been purified. He now stood alongside the truth. He had recognized and admitted his limitation. Months, even years would pass before he would fully absorb the consequences of this day, but he had made a start and would arrive in the Britannic Isles a different man. He had submitted himself to no more than he would have suffered at the hands of the Inquisition, and if he had done so, would have assuredly renounced his heresy, as he had this day admitted the truth and limitation of his medical research. He would have been released from the grip of those angels of death and lived on in Venetian splendour. The irony of his situation debased him, and with a loud cry of shame was reduced to a fresh flood of tears. The two attendants, with the merest glance between them and utterly without emotion, bowed over the tortured body, hung their weapons of humiliation, and retired. Later, as Frido looked down on his master's tortured back and saw the depth and severity of the wounds, anger formed in his mind. An anger that never before had he experienced. A surging, silent anger that spawned thoughts of rebellion and cast his mind into the future. Hitherto, in his world of the bonded servant, living in a rich man's household and giving his love to his master's son, all had been calm and dutiful. But now, with the added experience of the life of a fugitive, glimpses into the world of the Muslim, experience in his master's actions under duress, thoughts of freedom arose. He could not go on, and resolved to seek another life. The weeks passed, the wounds suppurated and would not heal, and this gave Frido time to himself, time to explore. He was excited by the hustle and goodwill bustle of the Egyptian souk, so different to the sombreness of the Venetian market. Looked in wonderment at the silks and spices and the bracelets, saw rings and necklaces hanging in the gold souk, so many variations in the colour of gold, from pale yellow to rose orange, and comprehended their beauty, but unattended, available to the touch, and thought, such wealth with no protection, there must be an explanation, and determined to learn more. On the holy day after the prayer called at Dura, Frido there must be an explanation, and determined to learn more. On the holy day after the prayer called at Duha, Frido went to the Friday mosque, and there on the steps joined a small group of men and boys and settled and to listen to the teaching of the Imam. He was a kindly man and knew that he was talking mainly to illiterates, and therefore spoke slowly and with limited vocabulary, and with the assistance of many drawings, charcoals on blocks of wood, and he drew his listeners in. Frido returned week after week and was enthralled by what he learnt, and the teacher singled him out and guided him towards the next stage of his learning, and very quickly Frido absorbed Arabic letters and began to read. His future was being moulded without thought. But Pietro, with his wounds clean and leaving scars he would always carry, was anxious to move on, and they set forth, travelling ever to the west, by dhow, by fishing smack, by camel, by donkey, by foot, and at last they came to Oran, in modern-day Algeria, as it then was, the far reaches of the Ottoman influence. By good fortune, Frido found an agent in Oran with a contact in Lisbon who would, he said, be prepared to help and transfer the two men in Lisbon to a London-bound freighter, but that he, the local agent, would, on protected business, travel with them to conclude the deal. Months passed. Uncertainty and suspicion were everywhere. The wait that gave Pietro the time to ponder all that had passed since his escape from Venice, time to regret his transgressions, but also time to look forward and plan his new life in the growing city of London, remembering always the horror of his experience in Alexandria, and knew his debasement would forever taint his life. Upon arrival in the Britannic Isles, he must quickly visit Cambridge and there meet with his old pupil Philippe and rekindle his love for all things Venetian. And as the days passed, the warmth of a Mediterranean spring, his confidence steadied. Frido also benefited from the delay. He had advised his master that it would be prudent to move away from the town and take refuge in neighbouring villages, and that he, Frido, would return to Oran from time to time and keep in contact with their agent, and this was done. The way of the Muslim increasingly attracted Frido, and unbeknown to his master, continued with his religious instruction and learned readily, and increasingly harboured the desire to break away from his degenerate that he called master, and he would choose his moment and abscond. Came the day of departure, and as the three travellers boarded their ship, Frido, on pretence of something forgotten, turned, ran down the gangplank, pushed his way through the grouping of townsfolk at his foot, and rushed to the shelter of the tents beyond. But Pietro had turned, taken by Frido's quickness of movement, and saw his manservant run, and was alarmed, but then realised on the instant that he was gone, and that he would never again see his manservant. And into his mind flashed the image of his anger with Frido and the crashing to the floor of a ruby-red glass goblet, and recalled that brief moment when he had lightly rested his hand on Frido's head and murmured the words of consolation, and realised his affection for the man, unspoken all these years, and he bade Frido Godspeed, turned and looked westward to the sea, and muttered, "How much longer am I to endure this confounded beard?" As it proved, no more than a day, for in that time the ship left waters under Ottoman dominance and entered Christian waters, and was thus safe in reshaping his beard from that to the biased Muslim, to that to the fashionable dandy. Incongruous though it may have been, worn with a thobe, but Pietro was beginning to feel a rekindling of a Venetian life within him, and thought not of the comparison. But there was laughter among the crew. With a stiff breeze in its sails, the ship made good progress, and apart from a small grouping of fishing vessels and a freighter on the horizon, saw no shipping close to, and some few days later entered the port of Lisbon. All was quiet. It was eerie. There was no hustle or bustle, no movement of ships, no movement of men, no derricks hauling cargoes aboard or swinging them ashore, no shouting of orders, no yelling of wenches selling their wares, no recruiting of ongoing crews, no shackled slaves, nothing. Nothing but an uncanny silence. The ship's crew took fright and hid in fear below the deck. It could only mean one thing. The plague had descended upon the town. And it proved to be to Pietro's benefit. He was safe from prying eyes. The agent, hungry for the gold due to him, was anxious to conclude the deal, and said that he would go and seek out his contact, and when he returned would bring a change of clothing for Pietro. This he did, and on the evening of the third day returned to say that all was well, and with Pietro dressed as a middle-class Portuguese businessman, bade farewell to the agent, and was mightily pleased to see him gone, and made his way to the ship that would take him on the last leg of his journey. On the evening of the 25th of October 1550, and on a rising tide with the sun low in the heavens, dressed with clouds of grey, and light rain in his face, Pietro stood on the ship's brow as the vessel made its way up the River Thames. He felt a sense of achievement in having outwitted the Inquisition, not being aware that the Catholic Church was in the ascendancy in the Britannic Isles under the influence of Mary Tudor, and that he would not be free from surveillance. Of a renewed sense of urgency to push forward with his research that would bring him nearer the truth of the function of the heart. Echoes of Alexandria plagued his mind, but he resolved to remember his humiliation, but rise above and not allow the experience to dwarf his ambition. He looked to the far shore, and there saw 2 moored cargoes flying the flag of the Venetian Republic, and looked to see if they carried the pennant of his father's trading company, but could not see sufficiently well through the light mist and fading light. Must inquire, thought he. He remained standing, doubts as to the future, doubts as to his family he had so abruptly left, and the consequences they may have faced as a result of his misdemeanours, as perceived by the Church, quickly replaced by surges of optimism, and watched as the ship came alongside at London Puddle Dock, and thought how prettily it came to. Discharging his dues and passing to the ferrymen that would take him on to his last short journey, to the start of his new life, what little baggage he had, Pietro took ferry for York Place. On the morrow, and dressed in his one suit, that of a Portuguese merchantman, Pietro hired a street urchin to guide him to Threadneedle Street and clear the pathway before him of discarded rubbish reduced to sludge by persistent London rain. And there, with credentials examined and accepted, was most warmly welcomed by his father's bankers. They were expecting him, they said, had been for some time. Pietro's father had written and set down the conditions and circumstances they were to oblige his son, and further requested that they inform him the moment his son arrived. On a more sombre note, the Albemarle Senior requested that he be informed should his son not present himself within 4 years. Thus, with preliminaries settled and funds made available and exchange rates explained, the group repaired to a coffee shop which the bankers proudly boasted was the finest within the city walls. Much was said. Other businessmen lounging and gossiping within the coffee shop introduced and cards exchanged, and there Pietro learnt that the Venetian cargoes seen on his way to the dock were not Albemarle's, but having established himself as the son of a highly regarded trader, Pietro was accepted with ongoing business assured. The worshipful companies established in the city were listed in the bank's introductions, along with letters to 2 members of the Royal College of Physicians, the very best tailor within the city walls, and barber surgeon were recommended, along with a short list of suitable houses that were currently available. And thus, with all due haste, Pietro took up residence in Bishopgate, and bought a house which had formed part of the dissolved Priory of St. Helens. This, in short time, did Pietro quickly and adroitly establish himself in the trading capital of the world, and the bankers nodded their heads in approval, and looked forward to continuing family relationship established by his father. Pietro would quickly become a man of consequence in trade, but Pietro was not well received by the Royal College of Physicians. They disliked his swagger as he walked in the Venetian manner. They disliked his ornamentation of dress. They were envious of the deep black cloth of his attire, the extravagant sword he insisted upon wearing, but particularly looked askance at his reference to his Venetian letter of introduction to the court of Queen Mary, and his desire to be of service to her. Pietro was aware he would be in need of the help of these 2 worthies of medicine, if such a contact was to be made, and thus must carry their favour, and this he would in due course. But he was, for the moment, more anxious to travel to Cambridge, and there meet Philippe, and be updated in all matters relating to the heart. And so to Cambridge did he repair. Pietro hired one horse for himself, along with a pack horse to carry his goods, and rather extensive and, it must be admitted, extravagant wardrobe, and 3 men to see him safely over the 60 miles that he must travel. Set off in the early hours of a truly beautiful October morning. The way ahead for the most part was little more than a track, with its upkeep sorely in need. It was law that these routes should be maintained, but contracts let for this purpose rarely honoured, and thus the journey was slow, and not without its difficulties. Time was not of the essence. The wealthy travelled slowly. They did not wish to be seen hurrying. Over-accommodation of near unacceptable standard, and so the journey made them more unpleasant and difficult. But on the afternoon of the 4th day of their travel, as they topped a low hill, Pietro, with much relief, espied in the far distance, through the haze of autumn sun, the spires of Cambridge. Pietro took lodgings, discharged 2 of the 3 men, retained the 3rd for his immediate use, and sent his salutations along with an invitation to Philippe to take breakfast with him the following day at 11 o'clock. Upon presenting himself to his past master, Pietro was much impressed by the sense of maturity and air of confidence exuded by his old pupil and assistant, and detected little of the Venetian about him. Philippe was quietly enthusiastic concerning the thinking of a first-year undergraduate who, like Pietro, was exploring the possibilities of the heart, and was the source of information to which Philippe referred to in his letter. "Oh, you see, sir." Here Philippe lowered his voice and moved closer to Pietro, lest he be overheard, and said, "Like you, sir, he believes the heart has a use. He has even suggested the possibility of it being a forward pump that maintains the circulation of the blood." Pietro received the information with joy. Joy that in the broadest of terms the theory supported his own thinking. "Philippe, I must meet this man. What is his name? When can we meet? You must bring him here. We have much to discuss. Make it tomorrow. No later, you understand. No later than tomorrow." But Philippe was not the enthusiastic student of yesteryear, attentive to the whims of his superiors. The passing years had matured the student. He was quiet, attentive, industrious, thoughtful, and much in control of his destiny, and felt that he had said too much, had broken a confidence, brought advanced thinking from within the sanctity of the university to the open world of gossip and mischief, with guardians of the church ever watchful, ever mindful of supposed heresy spawned by those within its walls. He regretted, but could not pass the name of the student, nor speak further on the subject. Pietro was annoyed. He felt his authority usurped, but cleverly accepted the wisdom of the refusal, and quickly foresaw a satisfactory manner in which a collaboration with the student could be made. Thus it was agreed that Philippe would speak with his colleague and suggest a meeting, but the student was not in agreement, and mildly rebuked his friend for breaking a confidence, and reminded Philippe of the fall in recent times of a lecturer from the university who had addressed a medical symposium in London, reported upon by a church spy, and fallen foul of the church authorities, interrogated and charged with heresy. Mary's Catholic Church was harsh and would not countenance contradiction. Pietro established himself within the university, generously offered a place at high table, and as a foil and cover to his intent, began work upon the preparation of papers relating to St. Anthony's fire, Wormfit and Planet Struck, but his thoughts were forever in the blood, and in this he collaborated most carefully with Philippe's student friend. Pietro's breeding, wealth and generosity greatly enhanced his standing within the fraternity, and when the chair of medicine became vacant, accelerated by its incumbent seizure of the heart, and taking into consideration, but not openly referred to, Pietro's gift of 6 matching, generously sized, silver gilt ears, the Venetian emigre became Professor Pietro Maria Adelmare, and felt himself ready to offer his services to the Queen, and returned to London and established himself anew at Bishopsgate. News of his father's passing he received with a heavy heart. He had loved and revered his father, had admired his father's business acumen, and his ability to accumulate great wealth through trade, his ability to foresee the future as commodity trade could be promoted by the discovery of new lands and sea routes. He was advised that the whole of his father's London interest, along with his fleet of 4 trading vessels, would pass to Pietro, while his father's local interest in Treviso would pass to Pietro's youngest brother. Pietro gave instruction that all 4 vessels should cease their present trading and report to London. It was his intent that one of the 4 captains would be made Commodore of the fleet and take control at sea, and that Pietro could find a London-based entrepreneur to oversee the whole project. He would talk over and take advice from his bankers, but his main interest must remain in the science of medicine, and that, like his father's capability in foreseeing the future of trade, so could he, the son, foresee the future of medical science. But first, he thought, he must resolve the question of the heart, and simultaneously, with these thoughts of grandeur, shades of Alexandria flashed into his mind and bit deeply into his resolve. The taking over of his father's trading vessels proved difficult. Over the course of the ensuing months, 2 vessels reported their arrival at Puddledock, neither with correct manifests, thus proving dishonest trading. The 3rd floundered on the Goodwin Sands during a night of a particularly fair storm, with the loss of life, and much pilfering from the residents of Whitstable, Ramsgate, and further inland Canterbury. The captain of the 4th vessel, upon receiving his instructions and learning of the death of his master, turned pirate, headed due east, and was not heard of again. Pietro counted his losses and was unnerved by the realization that a reduced income would impede and restrict his lifestyle, and this realization gave him the impetus to regroup, reform the fleet, and move forward. Pietro's cousin, Peter Adelmare, an experienced seaman and survivor of a wreck in northern waters off the coast of the Kingdom of Sweden, modern-day Denmark, was invited to England with appointment of Commodore in mind. Pietro was mindful of his cousin's shortcomings, but felt that under these reduced circumstances, a close family connection supervising the day-to-day activities of the fleet was the way forward. Peter was not of this opinion. Peter was not moulded in the Albemarle manner. He was perverse, a spendthrift, a womanizer, discarded his manner of upbringing and the faith in which he was raised, and went his own way. Straightforward tasks within the Adelmar enterprise were beyond his understanding, and he had been persuaded to take to the high seas by an exasperated father, desperate to do right by his wayward son, but found himself unable to help. On the receipt of Pietro's invitation, Pietro saw a splendid opportunity for self-advancement at the expense of his cousin, and arrived at Bishopsgate in a spirit of bon vivant and ever helpful. Peter's future, as he saw it, was on the upturn. It was in the year 1558, just 8 years after his arrival in these dark, fever-ridden, yet prosperous isles, that Professor Pietro Maria Adelmare was summoned to St. James's Palace. Queen Mary was in mortal danger. Pietro, one of 5 physicians, with 3 apothecaries standing in second rank, were grouped around the recumbent queen. She was in considerable discomfort. Earlier in the year she had suffered her second phantom pregnancy, and the learned physicians, as a consequence, considered the possibility of a stomach cancer, but there was no lump detected. And also perhaps, and a prescription of mint, wormwood and balms to calm her stomach was agreed, and the apothecaries, upon instruction to concoct, bowed reverently and withdrew from the royal presence. Professor Adelbari nodded in agreement when one of their number suggested a malignant ovarian cyst. Such reasoning is sympathetic to the Queen's difficulty in conceiving. But could it not be influenza, suggested Pietro. The sickness at that time was rampant in parts of London, and was not the Queen's principal adviser laid stricken with that very condition within this very building? The consultation, as was so often in the case in these circumstances, concluded unresolved, with opinions differing between the 5 great minds. The Queen, in great pain and without relief, died the following day at the age of 42, and was succeeded by her half-sister Elizabeth. Professor Adelmari was retained as physician to the new Queen, and Elizabeth took an immediate liking to her little Italian physician, was amused by his lack of inches, laughed at his swagger, purred gently when flattered with an accented tongue, admired his splendid dress, and called him her little Caesar. And Pietro was delighted. Vanity overcome his discretion, made a sweeping bow, begged the Queen to be given letters of naturalization and allow himself to be called Caesar. The Queen was amused by this ingratiation and granted his request, adding immunity from all taxation. And thus did Pietro prosper. He married upon the insistence of the Queen, taking as his bride a favourable recommended by the Queen, spawned a family of 4, and lived into old age. The horror of the Alexandria baths, a fading but ever recurring memory.